Islam Makhachev is everything the UFC claims to value in a champion. He wins consistently. He controls fights with near-perfect efficiency. He removes doubt, removes chaos, and leaves opponents with no room to improvise. And yet, despite holding the belt and dominating one of the UFC's most important divisions, Islam has never been positioned as the kind of star the promotion usually builds its business around. This is not an accident, and it is not a failure of personality or popularity. It is the result of a system colliding with a fighter it was never designed to handle. Islam's presence forces a question the UFC rarely has to answer. What happens when your champion doesn't create drama, doesn't fuel rivalries, and doesn't produce moments that can be exaggerated into spectacle? Islam doesn't win loudly. He doesn't win quickly. He wins by removing options, round after round, until the outcome becomes unavoidable. And that inevitability is precisely what makes him difficult to package. This video is about Islam Makhachev not as a myth, not as a threat, but as a stress test. A fighter whose career exposes the limits of how the UFC turns champions into stars, and why someone like Islam sits at the center of the sport while remaining outside its promotional comfort zone. Islam Makhachev entered the UFC into a system that already knew exactly what kind of star it wanted to create and exactly what kind it didn't know how to handle. From the moment he began winning consistently, Islam was measured against an invisible checklist that had nothing to do with titles or dominance. The UFC's star-making logic has always revolved around escalation, conflict that grows louder, personalities that clash publicly, narratives that peak in short, explosive moments. Islam never fit that logic. His wins didn't escalate tension, they drained it. Every fight followed the same unsettling pattern: pressure without spectacle, control without chaos, outcomes without debate. For the UFC, this creates a structural problem. A fighter like Islam doesn't generate rivalries naturally because his style leaves opponents with nothing to argue about afterward. There are no controversial moments to replay, no emotional collapses to sell, no unfinished business to hype. Even when he wins, the story ends cleanly. And a clean ending is bad for a business built on anticipation. Islam's career progression shows this clearly. He didn't rise through viral moments or personality-driven narratives. He advanced by quietly erasing contenders. Each victory strengthened his legitimacy, while simultaneously weakening his marketability within the UFC's existing framework. The system didn't reject Islam, it simply didn't know how to amplify someone whose success removes the very instability the UFC depends on to sell its biggest stars. What makes Islam Makhachev difficult for the UFC to build into a star isn't silence or humility, it's mechanical certainty. Islam doesn't just beat opponents. He collapses the space where narratives are supposed to grow. Every phase of his fighting style is designed to reduce variance. He doesn't chase finishes early, doesn't gamble for highlights, and doesn't allow fights to drift into moments where something unexpected can happen. That directly conflicts with how the UFC manufactures anticipation. The promotion relies on uncertainty. Who might get caught? Who might crack under pressure? Who might steal a round and flip momentum? Islam removes those questions almost immediately. Once the pattern of control understands what's coming long before the final horn, that predictability is devastating for hype. It means challengers can't build believable confidence, and promoters can't exaggerate danger without the footage betraying the story. Islam's fights don't produce ambiguity, they produce acceptance. And acceptance kills promotional tension. Even when he moves up in competition, the mechanism stays the same: pressure, grip, balance, patience. No visible desperation, no emotional spikes. The UFC can sell chaos, redemption, revenge, and rivalry. It struggles to sell inevitability. Islam doesn't undermine the UFC by refusing to play along. He undermines it by playing a game that ends too cleanly. His dominance doesn't create momentum, it absorbs it. And once momentum disappears, the promotional machine has nothing left to amplify. Islam Makhachev doesn't just challenge the UFC's promotional instincts, he exposes why those instincts cannot be recalibrated without breaking the system itself. The UFC cannot simply market him better, because the problem isn't effort, it's architecture. The promotion's entire growth model depends on repeatable volatility, stars who can be cycled through rivalries, escalations, setbacks, and comebacks. Islam doesn't generate cycles, he generates closures. Once he solves an opponent, that matchup is finished in the cleanest way possible, leaving no credible reason to revisit it. That creates a bottleneck the UFC cannot route around. Matchmaking becomes risk management instead of narrative building, and every successful defense narrows the future instead of expanding it. The UFC also cannot lean on selection because Islam's effectiveness is transferable. He doesn't rely on a single exploit that can be neutralized by style. His pressure, balance, and control translate across opponents without visible adaptation. That makes it impossible to engineer a dangerous style contrast that feels authentic. When the UFC promotes a challenger, the footage inevitably shows the same outcome Islam has already imposed on others. The more honest the promotion is, the flatter the story becomes. The more exaggerated it gets, the less credible it sounds. Either way, the machine loses leverage. There's also a financial constraint the UFC rarely acknowledges publicly. Stars are most valuable when they are fragile. A star who might lose creates urgency. A star who looks inevitable creates caution. Islam's consistency, last-minute reshuffles, and emergency headliners, all tools the UFC uses to stabilize pay-per-view cards under pressure. With Islam, there is no illusion of randomness to lean on. The belt doesn't feel like it's in motion. And when a title stops feeling mobile, it stops functioning as a promotional accelerant. Most importantly, the UFC cannot ask Islam to change without undermining its own authority. The promotion's brand is built on the claim that the best fighters rise naturally. If Islam were openly pressured to alter his approach for entertainment value, it would signal that dominance alone is no longer enough. That would fracture the meritocratic image the UFC depends on to maintain legitimacy. So the system remains stuck, unable to reshape Islam, unable to reshape itself. Every day is that standoff. The longer Islam holds the belt, the clearer it becomes that this isn't a temporary, no clean solution, FO. When Islam Makhachev sits at the top of the lightweight division, the damage isn't loud, it's systemic. The division stops behaving the way the UFC needs it to behave. Lightweight has historically been the promotion's most valuable ecosystem because it produces rotation. Contenders rise fast, styles clash violently, champions feel vulnerable, and storylines multiply naturally. Islam freezes that motion. His presence turns the division from a narrative engine into a queue. Fighters don't circle toward opportunity, they hesitate at the edge of inevitability. Winning a contender fight no longer feels like momentum, it feels like a sentence. This changes how fighters operate long before they ever face Islam. Contenders begin managing risk instead of chasing impact. They avoid exchanges that might expose them to the same suffocating control they've already seen dismantle others. That caution leaks into matchmaking. The UFC becomes forced to protect challengers from looking uncompetitive too early, spacing out fights, delaying title paths, stretching timelines. The belt no longer accelerates careers, it slows them down. And a slowed division loses one of its most valuable traits: constant renewal. From a promotional standpoint, Islam also collapses the illusion of parity. Lightweight is supposed to feel like anyone can win on a given night. Islam's reign makes that claim harder to sustain. When challengers are announced, the conversation shifts immediately from "can he win?" to "how long can he survive?" That framing is poison for pay-per-view storytelling. Survival isn't aspirational. It doesn't sell heroism or redemption. It sells endurance. And endurance has no sequel. The UFC's usual solution, injecting fresh blood, doesn't work here either. New contenders don't arrive with mystery. They arrive with footage. Fans have already learned how Islam dismantles archetypes: strikers, wrestlers, pressure fighters, technicians. Every new matchup feels like a variation of an answer we already know. That predictability flattens hype cycles and weakens undercards meant to build future stars. Islam's dominance doesn't just affect his opponents, it erodes the perceived upside of the entire ladder beneath him. Most critically, the lightweight division under Islam stops producing leverage for the UFC. Normally, divisions generate negotiation power, multiple contenders, overlapping claims, short windows of relevance. Islam compresses those windows until there's only one meaningful point of focus: himself. And a promotion built on multiplicity cannot function smoothly when one fighter turns abundance into scarcity. The division doesn't collapse, it stalls. And stalling, in a business driven by constant forward motion, is a far more dangerous outcome. What the UFC ultimately fears about Islam Makhachev isn't that he might lose interest, turn inactive, or even leave the promotion. The deeper fear is that Islam proves something the UFC has spent decades trying to deny. Dominance alone does not automatically translate into control. The UFC's power has always come from its ability to frame outcomes before they happen to shape expectations, define stakes, and guide attention. Islam resists that framing, not through rebellion, but through consistency. He does exactly what the system claims to reward, and in doing so, he reveals how little flexibility the system actually has. Islam's existence forces an uncomfortable comparison. When champions are volatile, the UFC can steer narratives around them. Losses reset arcs, close fights create debate, controversy creates leverage. Islam offers none of that. His wins don't invite reinterpretation. They don't create public arguments the promotion can amplify. They arrive, conclude, and move on. Over time, that begins to shift where authority appears to reside. Instead of the UFC dictating meaning, the fights themselves do. And that inversion is dangerous. A promotion can survive loud champions. It struggles when quiet ones make the product speak for itself. There's also a strategic fear beneath the surface: precedent. If Islam remains dominant without becoming a conventional star, he becomes proof that the UFC's star-making narrative is selective, not universal. Future champions may point to him as evidence that compliance isn't required for legitimacy. That weakens the promotional hierarchy. The UFC needs fighters to believe that visibility and value flow from alignment with the machine. Islam suggests another possibility: that winning cleanly, repeatedly, and without spectacle can still place a fighter at the center of the sport, even if the promotion is uncomfortable with it. This is why Islam is never positioned as a problem openly, yet never elevated fully. The UFC cannot afford to challenge his legitimacy, but it also cannot afford to let his model become aspirational. A roster full of Islams would be unmanageable. Fights would resolve too cleanly. Narratives would end too quickly. The constant churn the business depends on would slow to a crawl. So, Islam exists in a carefully maintained tension: champion, centerpiece, but never the template. In the end, Islam Makhachev doesn't threaten the UFC by breaking rules or rejecting the spotlight. He threatens it by exposing the limits of a system that only functions when uncertainty can be manufactured. As long as he remains dominant, he stands as a reminder that the UFC can crown the best fighter in the world without ever fully knowing what to do with him once it has. Islam Makhachev was never meant to become a star in the way the UFC understands stardom, and that's precisely why his reign matters more than any belt he holds. Islam forces a quiet confrontation between what the UFC claims to reward and what it actually knows how to monetize. He wins too cleanly to be controversial, too consistently to be dramatic, and too efficiently to leave room for reinvention. Every defense reinforces the same uncomfortable truth: the system can identify excellence, but it cannot always integrate it. As long as Islam remains at the top, the UFC is stuck managing a contradiction it can't resolve publicly: a champion who validates the sport while destabilizing the business model behind it. The real question isn't how long Islam will stay dominant. It's how long the UFC can operate without rewriting the rules it has relied on for decades. Because if dominance like this continues to exist without becoming marketable, then the problem isn't the fighter. The problem is the machine that never planned for someone like him to win this completely. Islam Makhachev doesn't just sit outside the UFC's star system, he defines the ceiling of it. His career exposes a limit the promotion rarely has to confront. There is a point where competitive excellence stops translating into expandable value. The UFC's star model depends on growth curves. Fighters rise, peak, stumble, recover, and re-enter relevance through new angles. Islam flattens that curve. He reaches the peak and stays there, without the volatility that allows the promotion to reshape him into different versions over time. That stability is efficient for sport, but corrosive for long-term storytelling. What makes this ceiling dangerous is that it isn't loud. Islam doesn't reject interviews, doesn't undermine cards, doesn't destabilize events. He fulfills every formal expectation of a champion. Yet his consistency quietly caps how much more the UFC can extract from his reign. There are only so many ways to reframe inevitability before it stops generating incremental returns. Each new title defense adds legitimacy, but subtracts elasticity. The audience doesn't lean forward asking what might happen. It leans back, waiting for confirmation. And confirmation does not scale. This is where legacy becomes a problem rather than an asset. Historically, UFC legacies are constructed through contrast eras defined by rivalry, controversy, or stylistic disruption. Islam's legacy is monotonic. It grows by accumulation, not by conflict. That makes it resistant to dramatization. The UFC cannot easily divide his career into chapters because the mechanism never changes. Pressure, control, submission threats, positional dominance. Over time, this produces a paradox. The longer Islam remains dominant, the less adaptable his story becomes. Legacy hardens into a single line instead of branching into marketable arcs. The ceiling becomes even clearer when compared to how the UFC manages succession. Most stars are valuable not just for what they are, but for who replaces them. Loss creates inheritance. Rivalries create transfer of relevance. Islam disrupts that transfer. There is no obvious heir who benefits narratively from facing him, because defeat under Islam rarely elevates the challenger. Losing decisively does not create sympathy or intrigue. It creates distance. The UFC cannot easily build the next star through Islam, which turns his dominance into a dead end rather than a bridge. This forces the promotion into a defensive posture. Instead of leveraging a champion to seed future stars, the UFC must protect the ecosystem around him, spacing contenders, delaying title shots, and managing expectations downward. Islam becomes an endpoint that must be navigated around, rather than a centerpiece that generates momentum outward. That inversion is costly. A champion is supposed to concentrate attention and then redistribute it. Islam concentrates attention and keeps it. The ceiling, then, is not about popularity. It's about conversion. Islam converts wins into certainty, but certainty resists expansion. The UFC can sell risk, aspiration, and upheaval. It struggles to sell permanence. And permanence is exactly what Islam represents when he remains untouched at the top. His career doesn't threaten the UFC's authority directly. It quietly demonstrates that the system's ability to manufacture stars has boundaries. Boundaries that appear only when someone wins too completely, for too long, without ever giving the machine something to reshape.